A routine grocery store visit takes a shocking turn when a single comment shatters the peace. What happens next leaves everyone stunned. Will kindness or conflict prevail? A routine grocery run erupts into an intense showdown, leaving everyone speechless. Don't miss this unforgettable moment. Be sure to subscribe for more stories that captivate and inspire. It was a typical Saturday afternoon in Jefferson City, Missouri. The grocery store on Main Street buzzed with weekend energy. Checkout lines filled with chatter, the rhythmic beeping of registers, and the steady movement of carts. Among the crowd, a tall black man in his early 30s, dressed in a simple white shirt and jeans, waited patiently in line. His small basket carried only a few essentials, a loaf of bread, some fruit, and a carton of milk. He appeared at ease, exchanging light-hearted banter with the young cashier ahead of him. She chuckled, responding warmly to his remark about the unpredictable weather. Their exchange was effortless, a fleeting moment of small-town charm in an otherwise rushed atmosphere. Just behind him, an older woman stood stiffly, her overflowing cart marking her impatience. Likely in her late 60s, her sharp features tightened as she shifted restlessly. Her gaze flicked toward the man in front of her, her expression hardening. Then, in a voice just loud enough to slice through the store's background noise, she muttered, "Why don't you go back to Africa?" The words landed like a thunderclap. The cashier froze mid-scan. Conversations halted. Heads turned. The man didn't flinch, his face unreadable as he glanced over his shoulder. The woman, undeterred, stood firm, her jaw tightening as if daring him to respond. Nearby, a mother instinctively pulled her child closer. A young man near the deli counter discreetly lifted his phone to record. The store held its breath, caught in the gravity of the moment. But instead of anger, the man responded with something no one expected. Calm, deliberate, powerful. He turned to her, his measured movements amplifying the tension. "Excuse me?" His voice was steady, quiet enough that those nearby had to lean in to catch it. The woman scoffed, arms crossing as she doubled down. "You heard me," she spat. "People like you don't belong here." Her words lingered in the air, like a bitter echo. A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. A man in a baseball cap whispered something to his wife, who frowned but stayed silent. The young cashier, her bright blue nails gripping the register, glanced between them, her cheeks flushed with unease. And yet, the man remained still, his gaze unwavering. What happened next? No one saw it coming. The room held its breath. All eyes were fixed on the woman. There was no anger in the man's gaze, just an unshakable calm that made her falter, if only for a second. But she quickly masked it, tightening her grip on the cart like a shield. A teenage girl in the next line leaned toward her father. "Dad, are you going to say something?" she whispered. Her father exhaled, shaking his head. "It's not our place." The man finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Do you know where I'm from?" His words were deliberate, measured. The woman scoffed, crossing her arms. "What difference does it make?" she shot back, her voice edged with impatience. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the kind of confidence that commanded attention. "It makes all the difference," he said, his voice steady, his words laced with an unshakable certainty. The entire store seemed frozen in place. Groceries were forgotten. Even the store manager, who had been watching nervously from behind the customer service desk, stood motionless. The man's eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of those who had been watching. Then he turned back to the woman. "This is my home," he said. "My family has been here for generations. My great-grandfather built houses in this very city, homes that some of your families might live in today. My grandmother was a nurse who worked double shifts to care for this community in its hardest times. He paused, then met her eyes directly. "Where are you from?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The woman blinked. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her grip on the cart tightened. Around them, the tension shifted, discomfort turning into something else. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe realization. Some lowered their gazes. Others looked at the woman, their faces a mix of disapproval and expectation. The man took another step forward. His posture was calm but unyielding. "This country," he said, "was built by people who look like me. People who toiled, who suffered, who fought, and who persevered. My ancestors endured more than you could imagine, and they did it so that future generations, your generation and mine, could have the freedom to stand in a store like this and buy groceries without being told we don't belong." His words struck like thunder, precise and undeniable. The young cashier wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. A few people in the crowd nodded subtly, their expressions softening as the weight of his message began to sink in. The woman, however, remained silent. Her defiance wavered, her expression shifting from anger to something else. Doubt? Uncertainty? But she said nothing. The man let the silence linger, its weight heavier than any argument. Then, with a quiet exhale, he looked around, meeting the eyes of the cashier, a woman in a floral blouse, and the young man still recording. Finally, he turned back to the woman, his voice quiet but firm. "You see, when I hear words like yours, they don't break me. They don't even surprise me anymore. But what they do remind me of is how much work there is left to do." The woman parted her lips as if to interject, but the man lifted a hand slightly, not as a command, but as a silent signal to let him finish. "You told me to go back to Africa," he said. "So let me tell you about the Africa you think I belong to." The air in the store seemed to thicken. The crowd unconsciously leaned in, drawn to his words. My ancestors were taken from their homes, their families, their lives, and brought here in chains. They didn't choose this land, but they made it their own. They built the foundation of this country, brick by brick, field by field, generation by generation. Their sweat, their tears, their blood are in the soil beneath your feet. His voice grew stronger, filling the space like an undeniable truth. And when slavery ended, they didn't stop building. A pause, the weight of history pressing down. My great-grandfather was a carpenter right here in Missouri. He built homes, churches, schools, places where families could live, grow, and dream. My grandmother? She was one of the first black nurses at the local hospital. She worked through segregation, through prejudice, through long nights where no one wanted to take orders from her because of the color of her skin. But she didn't give up. The woman shifted, crossing her arms tighter. The crowd? Captivated. The man continued, his voice unwavering. And my father? He fought in Vietnam. He served a country that still wouldn't serve him in many restaurants when he returned home. But he still believed in America, believed in its potential to be better. The woman's eyes flickered downward. Her jaw slackened ever so slightly. "And me?" the man continued. "I was born here. I went to school here. I work here. I pay my taxes, volunteer in my community, and raise my children to love this country. Not because it's perfect, but because it's ours." He gestured toward the store, his voice firm yet unshaken. "This country isn't just yours," he said. "It's ours. It's all of ours. And I'm not going anywhere. I belong here, just as much as you do, maybe even more, considering how long my family has been fighting for the right to simply exist in peace." A murmur rippled through the crowd, faint but undeniable. A man near the frozen foods aisle folded his arms, nodding in quiet agreement. The young cashier wiped another tear from her cheek. The woman, silent. The older woman's hands remained on the conveyor belt, her face now flushed. The bravado that had carried her earlier was gone, replaced by something more fragile. But the man wasn't finished. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm telling you this because you need to understand something. Hate doesn't solve anything. It doesn't build anything. All it does is tear people down. And it tears you down, too." His words hung in the air, settling deep into the spaces between them. Carrying that kind of anger, that kind of bitterness, it doesn't just hurt the people you aim it at. It hurts you. It shrinks you. And you don't deserve that. None of us do. The woman's grip on her cart loosened, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The man took a step back, giving her space. "You don't have to like me," he said. "You don't have to agree with me. But you should know, I'm not your enemy. I'm your neighbor. And whether you like it or not, we're in this together." Silence. A long, stretching moment of stillness, as if the world itself had paused to listen. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the woman's response, for the man to say more. But he didn't. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, his presence unwavering, allowing her the time to process everything he had said. And in that silence, something shifted, not just in her, but in everyone watching. The store seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with something unspoken. The older woman blinked rapidly, her face a storm of emotions, confusion, defensiveness, and most surprisingly, reflection. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if unsure of what to say. The onlookers remained transfixed, their gazes flicking between the two, feeling the weight of the moment. His words had struck a chord, not just with her, but with everyone in earshot. And then, breaking the silence, a voice, soft, trembling, but sure. That was beautiful," the young cashier murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Tears streaked her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. She looked at the man with unguarded gratitude. A murmur swept through the crowd, quiet at first, then growing. An older gentleman in a denim jacket clapped once, slow, deliberate, a single gesture that set off a ripple. One by one, others joined in. The applause was hesitant at first, unsure. But then, like a tide rolling in, it grew. Steady, sincere. The sound of it filled the store, echoing against the high ceilings, cutting through the tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't meant to be. But it was real. The man dipped his head slightly in acknowledgement, his expression one of quiet dignity. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. The older woman stood frozen, her expression unreadable. But her hands, which had been gripping the cart like a lifeline, slowly fell to her sides. Her cheeks burned, her eyes glistening with something unshed. Finally, she spoke. I didn't mean—" She stopped, searching for the right words. "I didn't think." The man lifted a hand, a gentle gesture. "It's okay," he said, his tone as forgiving as it was firm. "What matters is what you do from here. We all make mistakes. What defines us is how we choose to grow from them." Her lips quivered. A single tear slipped down her cheek. I'm sorry," she whispered. The words were fragile, but real. The man studied her for a moment, then offered a small, understanding smile. Apology accepted. A breath. A collective exhale from the crowd. The tension that had once gripped the room seemed to dissolve, replaced by something else. A quiet resolution. A shift in the air. But the moment wasn't over. From the back of the crowd, a small voice. "Mister?" A boy, no older than 10, stepped forward, clutching a candy bar in one hand. His eyes were wide, earnest. "What you said was really brave." The man knelt slightly, bringing himself to the boy's level. His expression softened, warmth replacing the steel that had carried him moments before. "Thank you," he said. "But you know what? Kindness is the bravest thing anyone can do." He placed a hand gently over his heart. "If you remember that, you'll always be strong." The boy smiled shyly and stepped back into the warm embrace of his mother, who looked at the man with quiet gratitude. There were no words exchanged between them. None were needed. Near the customer service desk, the store manager finally stepped forward. He had been watching from a distance, clearly uneasy, but knowing he had to address what had unfolded. Clearing his throat, he approached the man. "Sir," he said, his voice measured yet sincere, "on behalf of our store, I want to apologize for what happened here today. That kind of behavior isn't acceptable, and we'll make sure it's addressed." The man studied him for a brief moment, then extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, shaking the manager's hand with quiet strength. "I appreciate that." Off to the side, the older woman stood watching, her arms crossed in front of her, not out of defiance, but out of uncertainty. She seemed different now, not smaller in stature, but in presence. The anger that had once fueled her had melted away, leaving behind something rawer, something more vulnerable. She wasn't just confronting him anymore. She was confronting herself. The applause had faded, and one by one the crowd resumed their shopping. But the energy in the air had shifted. There was no returning to what the store had been before the exchange. Something had changed, something subtle but undeniable. Some customers glanced at the man as they passed, as if trying to hold on to a piece of the moment, carrying it with them like a stone tucked into their pocket. Others simply moved through the aisles, their expressions softer, their steps quieter, as if still absorbing what had transpired. Near the checkout, the older woman lingered, hesitating at the edge of the line. Her hands rested lightly on her cart, her gaze flickering between the floor and the man she had confronted. He noticed. He gave her a small nod, not of victory, not of gloating, but of something gentler, understanding. A silent acknowledgement of what had passed between them, a moment of closure. Turning back to the register, the man set his items on the conveyor belt. The young cashier, still visibly moved, leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet, but filled with conviction. "You know," she said, "I'll never forget what you said today. I think a lot of us won't." The man offered her a tired but genuine smile. "Thank you," he replied. "Some tea."